"You were never really a Mitchell," my uncle declared, his voice cold as the January rain pelting the windows of my grandfather's study. "Half-bloods don't qualify for the inheritance. That's why you're not in the will." I stood frozen, still, in my black funeral dress, the shock of his words hitting harder than the death of the grandfather I had adored my entire life. 3 days after burying him, I discovered that blood, or the alleged lack of it, was about to cost me my birthright and my future. But what my power-hungry uncle didn't know was that Grandpa Theodore had left one final move in our chess game, a sealed letter that would turn the entire Mitchell family legacy upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled study felt suddenly airless, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves closing in around me. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and my grandfather's pipe tobacco, once comforting, now seemed to mock the memories I'd cherished. My Uncle Richard paced before the ornate fireplace, his reflection distorted in the antique mirror above it, multiplying his presence like the growing threat he posed. "I don't understand," I finally managed, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What do you mean I'm not a Mitchell?" Richard's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Your mother's little indiscretion before she married my brother isn't as secret as she hoped." Theodore was traditional to his core. Blood purity mattered to him above all else. "Why do you think he left everything to me and my children?" "My name is Olivia Mitchell. I'm 28 years old, and until 5 minutes ago I believed I was the beloved granddaughter of Theodore Mitchell, legendary federal judge and collector of rare first-edition books. The grandfather who taught me chess every Sunday afternoon for 20 years, who funded my law school education, who beamed with pride when I passed the bar exam. The man who, just 2 weeks before his unexpected heart attack, had squeezed my hand during our weekly dinner and said, "You're the best of us, Livy. Never forget that." Now, standing in his historical Beacon Hill home in Boston, I was apparently discovering that my entire identity had been built on a lie. Or at least, that's what my uncle wanted me to believe. "I need to see the will," I said, straightening my shoulders and meeting Richard's gaze directly. "Harrison will read it formally on Friday," he replied dismissively, referring to my grandfather's longtime attorney. "But I've already reviewed it with him. You're mentioned only in passing, a small bequest for my granddaughter Olivia, a token gesture. The Mitchell Trust, the house, the collections, all pass through legitimate bloodlines." The word legitimate landed like a slap. I tried to process what he was telling me. If I truly wasn't Theodore's biological granddaughter, why had he never given any indication during our extraordinarily close relationship? And if he had known, and it hadn't mattered to him, why would he structure his will to exclude me? None of it made sense, especially given our last conversation about his legacy plans. "Grandpa specifically told me he was leaving me his book collection," I said, my voice gaining strength as indignation began to overpower shock. "He said it was always intended for the family scholar." Richard's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Sentimentality. Theodore always had a soft spot for you, despite knowing the truth. Fortunately, legally binding documents care about facts, not feelings." As he strode toward the door, he paused. "I've already had Harrison begin the process of transferring the book collection to auction houses. The family needs liquidity, not dusty volumes gathering mold." The casual mention of selling my grandfather's precious collection, books he had spent decades carefully curating, volumes he had taught me to handle with reverent hands, triggered something primal within me. These weren't just valuable objects. They were the physical manifestation of our bond. "You can't do that," I said, my voice low but firm. "Not until the will is officially read." "Watch me," Richard replied, his hand already on the ornate brass doorknob. "Blood will tell, Olivia. It always does." As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank into my grandfather's leather chair, running my fingers across the worn desk where he had written countless legal opinions, personal correspondence, and apparently, his final will and testament. My phone vibrated with an incoming message, briefly illuminating the darkness that had settled over me. It was from my mother. "We need to talk tonight. Alone." I stared at the screen, unease crawling through me. If what Richard suggested was true, my mother had kept this secret for nearly 3 decades. More importantly, why was this alleged truth surfacing now, just days after my grandfather's death, and days before his considerable fortune would be distributed? The Mitchell family wealth wasn't just substantial, it was dynastic. My great-grandfather had founded Mitchell Shipping during the post-war boom, and each generation had expanded the family's holdings into new territories: real estate, technology investments, art collections valued in the millions. My grandfather, as the family patriarch, had controlled the Mitchell Trust that managed these diverse assets. Growing up as a Mitchell meant navigating complicated family dynamics beneath a veneer of Boston Brahmin respectability. Richard, my father's older brother, had always been openly ambitious about his position in the family hierarchy. My father, William, more scholarly and reserved, had been content with his professor's life at Harvard, showing little interest in the family's business affairs. Uncle Richard had 2 sons, cousins I had never been particularly close to, who had followed him into the business side of the family enterprise. They were cut from the same cloth as their father, pragmatic, profit-focused, and perpetually concerned with the Mitchell legacy as measured in dollars and cents rather than reputation or contribution. I had always been the family outlier. Instead of pursuing business or academia like my father, I had chosen law, inspired by my grandfather's distinguished judicial career. The conscience of the family, Theodore had called me with affectionate pride, supporting my interest in public service law rather than the more lucrative private practice Richard had repeatedly suggested. This divergence had created tension. Certainly, but never had I imagined that Richard harbored such a fundamental rejection of my very place in the family. The implication that I wasn't truly a Mitchell struck at the core of my identity. As the rain intensified outside, pounding against the leaded glass windows of the study, I began to examine the room more carefully. This had been my grandfather's inner sanctum, the place where he retreated to think, to read, to make his most important decisions. If there were answers to be found, surely this would be where he would leave them. The study had remained untouched since his death. Family members had gathered in the formal living rooms and dining room after the funeral, but this space, always somewhat sacred, had remained closed. I had come here seeking solitude, a private moment to feel close to him again, only to have Richard shatter that possibility with his cruel revelation. My grandfather had been meticulous in his habits, everything in its proper place. The leather-bound notebooks where he recorded his thoughts lined one shelf in chronological order. His legal references were arranged by subject and relevance. Even his desk maintained a strict organizational system: correspondence to the left, current reading to the right, working documents in the center. Something about the scene before me seemed subtly wrong. The center of the desk was clear, except for a leather desk blotter. No papers, no open books, no indication of interrupted work. Given that his death had been sudden, I would have expected some evidence of his last activities. I opened the central drawer, finding the expected items: fountain pens, letter opener, notepad. Nothing unusual. The side drawers contained files organized with his characteristic precision. I was about to close the drawer when I noticed a small brass key taped to the underside of the desk, hidden, but in a place he knew I would eventually look. My heart raced as I carefully detached it. The key was small, likely for a box rather than a door. Without conscious decision, I found myself turning toward the bookcase that housed his most valuable first editions, the one section he had always opened for me himself, never allowing even household staff to handle the rare volumes. Behind the glass-fronted bookcase stood a volume of Dickens' Great Expectations that had always been positioned slightly forward of the others, a deliberate imperfection in his otherwise perfect system that I had questioned once. "Sometimes, Livy," he had said with an enigmatic smile, "the most important patterns are the ones that break the pattern." I opened the bookcase with trembling fingers and carefully removed the Dickens volume. It was heavier than a book should be, and upon opening it, I discovered it had been hollowed out, a hidden compartment containing a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside lay a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive hand, along with a small velvet pouch. I opened the envelope first, unfolding thick cream stationery embossed with his monogram. "My dearest Olivia, if you are reading this, I am gone, and certain unpleasant truths have likely been thrust upon you in the most unkind manner. Richard has suspected for years what I have known with certainty since the day you were born, that William is not your biological father. What Richard does not know, what no one but your mother and I have known, is the complete truth of your parentage. The Mitchell blood indeed runs in your veins, Olivia, though not through the path anyone has assumed." My hands shook so badly that I could barely continue reading. Whatever revelation awaited me in this letter, I knew with absolute certainty that it would irrevocably change not just my understanding of my place in the family, but the very foundation of who I believed myself to be. As the rain continued to lash against the windows and night settled fully over Boston, I steadied myself and continued reading, unaware that the true battle for the Mitchell legacy was only just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The contents of my grandfather's letter threatened to upend everything I had ever known about myself and my family. My hands trembled as I continued reading, the weight of his words pressing down on me with each sentence. "What Richard does not know, what no one but your mother and I have known, is the complete truth of your parentage. The Mitchell blood indeed runs in your veins, Olivia, though not through the path anyone has assumed. Your mother, Catherine, came to me in terrible distress 29 years ago. She and William had been trying to conceive without success. Medical tests had confirmed that William, my beloved son, your presumed father, was incapable of fathering children. The Mitchell line, at least through William, would end. Catherine was desperate for a child. William was heartbroken at his inability to provide what they both wanted so desperately. It was during this period of profound family crisis that Catherine developed a brief connection with Robert, my younger son and Richard's brother. I nearly dropped the letter, the shock of this revelation momentarily paralyzing me. Robert Mitchell, my uncle, my father's youngest brother, was my biological father, the man who had died in a sailing accident when I was just 3 years old, whose face I knew only from photographs, whose name was rarely mentioned in family gatherings. With shaking hands, I forced myself to continue reading. It was a moment of mutual vulnerability and comfort that went too far. Robert confessed everything to me immediately afterward, consumed by guilt. Catherine confirmed it weeks later when she discovered she was pregnant. The three of us, Robert, Catherine, and I, made a pact. William would never know. He would believe the medical diagnosis had been wrong, that a miracle had occurred. The child, you, my precious Olivia, would be raised as William and Catherine's daughter, and the Mitchell bloodline would continue. Robert accepted this arrangement out of love for his brother and profound remorse for his momentary transgression. When he died in that terrible accident just 3 years later, the secret became even more permanently sealed. I tell you this, now not to cause you pain, but because Richard has discovered partial truths. He knows or suspects that William is not your biological father. What he does not know is that Robert is. He assumes, as does everyone, that your mother had a liaison with someone outside the family, making you, in Richard's antiquated and repugnant worldview, unworthy of the Mitchell legacy. But you are a Mitchell by blood, Olivia. You are Robert's daughter, and therefore as much entitled to the family legacy as Richard's sons. The velvet pouch contains DNA evidence, hair samples from Robert preserved in his personal effects, which I've kept all these years. There is also a handwritten acknowledgement from Robert of his paternity, witnessed by me but never filed legally. These will be sufficient to establish your legitimate claim to the Mitchell inheritance, should Richard force the matter through legal channels. I have structured my will carefully, with provisions that hinge upon bloodline verification. Richard believes these will disqualify you. He is in for a considerable surprise. I have loved you from the moment you drew your first breath, not because of whose blood runs in your veins, but because of the remarkable person you have always been. You are the best of us all, brilliant, compassionate, principled. The Mitchell legacy needs your stewardship far more than it needs Richard's avarice or his son's entitlement. Know that whatever path you choose, whether to reveal these truths or to walk away from the complications of our family's legacy, you have my blessing and my eternal love. Your devoted grandfather, Theodore Mitchell, P.S. Should you need an ally in navigating the legal complexities ahead, contact Elaine Winters. She was my clerk during my final years on the bench and now practices family law. She has a sealed letter with additional instructions and has been paid a retainer to assist you should you require her services. I set the letter down and moved toward the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, Boston's historic streets glistened beneath street lamps, rain transforming the cobblestones into rivers of reflected light. The city felt both intimately familiar and suddenly alien, just like my own reflection staring back at me from the darkened window. Who was I now? Still Olivia Mitchell, but suddenly the daughter of a ghost, an uncle I barely remembered, whose face I knew primarily from the formal portrait hanging in the family gallery alongside generations of Mitchell patriarchs. I had his eyes, I realized with a jolt. The distinctive Mitchell gray-blue that had always been attributed to a happy genetic coincidence, a family trait somehow expressing itself despite my supposed lack of Mitchell blood. My mind raced through implications, recalculating every family interaction through this new lens. My father, no, William, had always been kind but somewhat reserved, a temperament I had attributed to his scholarly nature. Had some unconscious part of him always sensed I wasn't truly his child? And Richard, had his lifelong dismissiveness toward me stemmed from suspicion about my parentage? Or had he learned the partial truth later? Most pressing was the question of my mother, who had texted just minutes ago asking to meet. Had Richard already confronted her with his suspicions? Was she reaching out to finally reveal a lifetime of deception, unaware that Grandpa Theodore had already torn away the veil? I carefully returned the letter and DNA evidence to the wooden box, locking it securely. This revelation was mine to control now. When and how these truths would be shared would be my decision, not Richard's. Slipping the box into my handbag, I left the study with a new sense of purpose, the initial shock giving way to strategic determination. The main hall of the Mitchell mansion stretched before me, its walls lined with ancestors whose blood, I now knew with certainty, ran through my veins. Their stern portraits seemed to watch my passage with new interest, as if the house itself recognized a shift in the familial power dynamics. I was halfway to the front door when Richard emerged from the drawing room, 2 tumblers of amber liquid in his hands. His expression suggested he hadn't expected to find me still on the premises. Still here, Olivia? I thought our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. He extended one of the glasses toward me. Perhaps a conciliatory drink before you go. 18-year-old Macallan, Theodore's favorite. The gesture, superficially gracious, carried undertones of premature victory celebration. I regarded the offered glass without taking it. I'm curious, Uncle Richard, I said, emphasizing the familial title. When did you discover what you believe to be the truth about my parentage? His eyes narrowed slightly at my phrasing. Does it matter? The facts remain unchanged. Indulge me. As you've pointed out, I'm about to lose my place in this family. Consider it a parting curiosity. Richard took a sip from his own glass, apparently deciding that satisfying my question posed no threat. Theodore kept meticulous records, medical, files, personal correspondence, journals. As executor, I've had access to family archives that have been illuminating. And you took it upon yourself to investigate my parentage specifically? That seems unusually focused. A flicker of something, defensiveness perhaps, crossed his features before his practiced composure returned. The Mitchell Trust has specific provisions regarding bloodline succession. As trustee, I have fiduciary responsibilities to ensure proper distribution. How convenient that your interpretation of those responsibilities increases your own portion of the inheritance, I observed, mildly. Richard's expression hardened. Be careful, Olivia. Your precarious position hardly benefits from antagonizing me. I could have simply let you discover your exclusion during the will reading. My advance warning was a courtesy. Was it? I maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. Or was it an attempt to ensure I wouldn't contest the will, to shock me into compliance before I could consider my options? Contest all you like, Richard replied, draining his glass. DNA testing will only confirm what I've told you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to discuss with Harrison regarding the disposition of Theodore's assets. He set down his empty glass on a side table with deliberate precision. I'll see you at the will reading on Friday. Do try to maintain composure when the terms are officially announced. Scenes are so undignified, don't you think? I watched him retreat toward the library where Harrison Mills, the family attorney, was presumably waiting. For the first time, since receiving my grandfather's letter, I felt a flicker of something like satisfaction. Richard was so confidently moving pieces on a chessboard while missing half the game. I'll be there, I called after his retreating form. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the night air crisp and clarified. I texted my mother to arrange our meeting at her small apartment in Cambridge rather than at the family home she had shared with William. Whatever conversation awaited us, it would be better conducted away from the Mitchell mansion's watchful portraits and Richard's potential eavesdropping. Her response came quickly. Please come. I've been dreading this day for 28 years. The drive across the Charles River gave me time to process the cascading revelations. Beyond the personal shock of discovering my true paternity lay a complex web of practical implications. If I was indeed Robert Mitchell's biological daughter, as Theodore's letter claimed, then Richard's attempt to exclude me from the inheritance based on bloodline would ironically strengthen my claim rather than eliminate it. Robert had been the youngest of the three Mitchell brothers. While Richard had followed the traditional path into the family business and William had pursued academia, Robert had been the family rebel, artistic, impulsive, more interested in sailing and adventure than balance sheets or scholarly pursuits. The few family stories about him painted a picture of someone perpetually at odds with Richard's rigid adherence to tradition. That I might be Robert's daughter carried a certain poetic justice. The brother Richard had always considered the family disappointment might now, through me, challenge Richard's control of the Mitchell legacy. The thought brought a grim smile to my face as I navigated Cambridge's narrow streets. My mother's apartment occupied the top floor of a Victorian house near Harvard Square, its bay windows overlooking the bustling heart of Cambridge. Unlike the Mitchell mansion's formal grandeur, this space reflected her personal aesthetic: warm colors, comfortable furnishings, walls lined with books, and art collected during her years as a museum curator. She opened the door before I could knock, her face pale but composed. At 58, Catherine Mitchell remained striking, her silver-streaked dark hair framing features that had lost none of their elegance with age. Tonight, however, she looked smaller somehow. The confident posture I had always admired now burdened by visible anxiety. "You know," she said simply, reading my expression. It wasn't a question. I nodded, following her into the living room where tea had been prepared, a ritual she had always turned to in moments of stress. Neither of us spoke as she poured, the familiar domestic routine providing momentary structure amid emotional chaos. "Richard told me I'm not William's daughter," I finally said, watching her carefully. "And Grandpa Theodore left me a letter, explaining that I'm actually Robert's child." My mother's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "Theodore knew I would never find the courage to tell you myself. He promised he would ensure you learned the truth if anything happened. To him." She looked up, meeting my gaze directly for the first time. "Are you very angry with me?" The question caught me off guard. In the whirlwind of revelations, I had been so focused on the implications for my inheritance and position within the family that I hadn't fully processed my emotional response to my mother's decades-long deception. "I don't know what I feel. Yet," I answered honestly, "shocked, confused. But I need to understand everything if I'm going to navigate what comes next." Relief visibly washed over her at my measured response. "Ask me anything. After 28 years of secrets, I owe you complete honesty." "Did William ever know? Does he suspect now?" She shook her head firmly. "Never. The medical diagnosis was definitive. He couldn't father children. When I became pregnant, he believed it was the miracle we had been praying for. His love for you has always been genuine, Olivia. Please don't doubt that." "And Robert?" "Grandpa's letter says he knew that he agreed to let William raise me as his own. Robert was—" She paused, searching for words. "Complicated, brilliant, and charismatic, but troubled. What happened between us was brief, a moment of mutual vulnerability during a painful time in my marriage. He loved William deeply and was devastated by his own lapse in judgment. Allowing William to believe you were his child was Robert's way of making amends." "Did he ever try to establish a relationship with me before he died? Did he look at me differently, knowing I was his daughter?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "He was extraordinarily gentle with you during those first 3 years. While Richard's boys barely registered on his radar, he always made time for you. I think Theodore recognized it too, that special attention. It's why he wasn't surprised when Robert confessed the truth to him. I absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with my few hazy memories of a tall, laughing man who had once let me sit on his shoulders at a family gathering, who had carved a tiny wooden sailboat that had sat on my childhood bookshelf, until I left for college. "Richard suspects I'm not William's daughter," I said, redirecting the conversation to more immediate concerns. "But he doesn't know about Robert. He thinks my biological father was someone outside the family." "Richard has always excelled at discovering half-truths that serve his interests," my mother replied, a hint of the strength I recognized returning to her voice. "He's been looking for ways to consolidate his control over the Mitchell assets for decades. Theodore's will must have provisions that threatened that control. Grandpa's letter mentioned that the will contains conditions related to bloodline verification. Richard thinks those conditions will disqualify me. But instead, they'll confirm your Mitchell heritage through Robert," my mother concluded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Theodore was always 3 moves ahead, especially when it came to Richard's ambitions. "I have DNA evidence and a written acknowledgement from Robert," I confirmed. "Grandpa left them for exactly this scenario." My mother shook her head in quiet amazement. "Of course he did. Theodore protected his own." "There's something I still don't understand," I said after a moment of reflection. "If Grandpa knew the truth all along, why construct a will with bloodline conditions at all?" Why not simply leave his estate as he wished without creating this potential conflict? Because Theodore believed in family governance through consensus. Whenever possible, my mother explained. The Mitchell Trust was established by his father with specific succession provisions. Theodore could distribute his personal assets however he chose, but the trust governance followed bloodline protocols established generations ago. By creating conditions that would confirm your Mitchell bloodline rather than simply asserting it, he ensured your position would be legally unassailable, and specifically designed to counter whatever scheme Richard might attempt, I added, beginning to appreciate the strategic foresight my grandfather had employed. Theodore watched Richard maneuver for advantage their entire lives. He would have anticipated every argument, every technicality Richard might exploit. My mother reached across the table to grasp my hand. Your grandfather had absolute faith in your ability to stand your ground once armed with the truth. That's why he left the decision of how to proceed entirely in your hands. I squeezed her fingers in response, finding unexpected strength in this connection despite the deceptions that had defined it for so long. Whatever complicated emotions I might eventually need to process regarding my mother's choices, in this moment we were allies facing a common adversary. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. The path forward contained legal, financial, and deeply personal dimensions, each requiring thoughtful navigation. First, I'll contact Elaine Winters as Grandpa suggested. I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into at Friday's will reading. And William? My mother's voice held a note of fear. Will you tell him? The question gave me pause. William Mitchell, the man who had raised me, who had patiently taught me to ride a bicycle, who had written heartfelt notes of encouragement before every important exam of my academic career, had built his relationship with me on an unwitting foundation of deception. Learning that I was not his biological child would cause pain I could scarcely imagine. Not yet, I finally decided. There are too many unknowns. I need to understand the full legal situation before making decisions. That can't be unmade. My mother nodded, visible relief softening her features. He loves you so much, Olivia. That part has never been anything but completely genuine. I know, I said softly, memories of his quiet, consistent presence throughout my life rising to the surface. Whatever biology might dictate, William Mitchell had been my father in every way that truly mattered. As the evening deepened around us, my mother shared details about Robert that had never been discussed in family gatherings. His passionate commitment to environmental causes, his talent for sailing that had ultimately led to his death during a sudden storm off Cape Cod, his complicated relationship with his older brothers. With each revelation, the shadowy figure from family photographs gained dimension, becoming a person rather than merely a name on my newly discovered paternity. You have his eyes, my mother said softly as our conversation wound down. And his laugh. Sometimes when you were little, the sound of your laughter would stop Theodore in his tracks. I think he heard Robert in it too. As I prepared to leave, my mother pressed a small velvet box into my hand. Robert gave this to me when we were teenagers. I've kept it all these years, even though I never felt I had the right to wear it. It should be yours now. Inside was a delicate silver pendant, a sailing ship with tiny sapphires set as stars above it. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly. Custom-made rather than mass-produced. He designed it himself, my mother explained. Robert had an artist's eye and surprising patience for detailed work when it captured his imagination. I fastened the necklace around my throat, the weight of it unfamiliar yet somehow right. It represented a connection to a father I had never known I had, a tangible link to heritage that Richard could never dispute or diminish. Thank you, I said simply, embracing her with genuine warmth for the first time since learning the truth. Whatever complicated reckoning might lie ahead in our relationship, in this moment, Gratitude for her honesty felt more important than judgment of her past decisions. Driving back to my apartment in the South End, I felt a curious sense of clarity, emerging from the day's turbulence. I had awakened this morning as Olivia Mitchell, granddaughter of Theodore, daughter of William and Catherine, cousin to Richard's sons, my identity and place in the family constellation fixed and familiar, if sometimes uncomfortable. I would go to sleep tonight as something more complex. Still Olivia Mitchell, but now the biological daughter of Robert, the secret granddaughter of Theodore in a more direct line than anyone but my mother had known, and the unwitting centerpiece of my grandfather's final chess move against Richard's ambitions. The Mitchell family legacy, with all its privilege, responsibility, and complication, hadn't been taken from me as Richard had intended. Instead, my claim to it had been fundamentally transformed, rooted now in truths that would reshape not just my understanding of myself, but the entire power structure that had defined the Mitchell family for decades. As Boston's skyline came into view, illuminated against the night sky, I felt my grandfather's presence almost tangibly. His strategic mind, his unwavering belief in my capacity to handle difficult truths, his determination to ensure justice, even from beyond the grave. The road ahead would be challenging, but I was no longer navigating it blindly. Richard had declared that blood would tell. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The morning after my conversation, with my mother dawned cold and clear, Boston's skyline crisp against a cloudless January sky. I had slept little, my mind churning with revelations and strategies, plotting my next moves as carefully as my grandfather would have. The weight of Robert's pendant against my collarbone served as a tangible reminder of everything that had changed in the span of 24 hours. My first priority was contacting Elaine Winters, the attorney my grandfather had mentioned in his letter. A quick internet search revealed her to be a formidable presence in Boston's legal community. Harvard law graduate, former clerk to Theodore during his tenure as federal judge, now partner at a boutique firm specializing in trust and estate law. Her professional biography mentioned a particular expertise in complex family succession issues, a specialization that now seemed deliberately relevant to my situation. Her office agreed to see me immediately when I mentioned Theodore Mitchell's name, a response that confirmed my grandfather's foresight in arranging this connection. The firm occupied the top floor of a restored brick building in the financial district, its reception area understated, yet conveying unmistakable prestige through carefully selected art and impeccable furnishings. Elaine Winters emerged from her office to greet me personally, a tall woman in her early 40s with a direct gaze and purposeful movements. Her handshake was firm, her assessment of me swift and professional. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, gesturing me into her office. "Judge Mitchell spoke of you often. I've been expecting your call, though I confess I'd hoped circumstances would allow us to meet under different circumstances." The office was a corner unit with windows overlooking the harbor, shelves of legal texts lining two walls. On her desk stood a framed photograph of a much younger Elaine alongside my grandfather on the courthouse steps, both in judicial robes. "You clerked for my grandfather," I observed, nodding toward the photograph. "The most formative professional experience of my career," she confirmed, settling behind her desk. Theodore Mitchell was brilliant, principled, and meticulously prepared, qualities I've tried to emulate in my own practice. She opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope bearing my name in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "He left this with me approximately 6 months ago, with instructions to provide it to you if you sought my counsel after his death. He also established a substantial retainer for my services on your behalf." The envelope contained a brief letter of introduction, confirming Elaine's awareness of the broad outlines of my situation and her readiness to assist with legal matters related to the Mitchell Trust and inheritance. The letter concluded with a personal note that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Elaine possesses not only exceptional legal acumen, but also unwavering integrity. In the chess game that may unfold, She is the queen on your side of the board, the most powerful piece in play. Use her capabilities wisely, Livy. I have every confidence in both of you. I handed the letter to Elaine, who scanned it quickly before returning it to me. Your grandfather was characteristically thorough in preparing me for various contingencies, she said, though he was careful not to reveal details that weren't his to share. Perhaps you could bring me up to speed on current developments? Over the next hour, I provided a comprehensive account of recent events: Richard's ambush in my grandfather's study, the revelation of my true parentage, the DNA evidence and acknowledgement from Robert, and the upcoming will reading. Elaine listened intently, occasionally taking notes but mostly absorbing the information with professional composure. To summarize, she said when I had finished, Richard Mitchell believes you are not a biological Mitchell and intends to use bloodline provisions in the trust and will to exclude you from significant inheritance. However, you have evidence confirming you are actually the biological daughter of Robert Mitchell, which would not only maintain your inheritance rights, but potentially strengthen them due to your direct bloodline to Theodore through his son. That's correct, I confirmed, though I'm not entirely clear on the legal implications of these bloodline provisions or how they interact with the Mitchell trust structure. Elaine nodded, rising to retrieve a thick file from a cabinet. Judge Mitchell anticipated this question. With your permission, I'd like to explain some background on the Mitchell family legal structures that may clarify the situation. She spread several documents on the desk between us. The Mitchell family assets exist in 3 distinct categories, each with different governance structures. First, there's the Mitchell Family Trust established by your great-grandfather Samuel Mitchell in 1952. This trust controls the core family businesses, shipping, real estate holdings, and major investments. Its governance provisions require a Mitchell by blood to serve as primary trustee, with succession following the male line unless no male heirs exist. Archaic, I commented. Indeed, Elaine agreed, but legally binding unless formally amended, which would require unanimous consent from all adult beneficiaries, something Richard would obviously never provide if it diminished his control. She pointed to another document. The second category is Theodore's personal estate, assets. He acquired independently throughout his life rather than inherited through family channels. This includes his book collection, art investments, and several properties including the Beacon Hill home. These assets fall under his personal will rather than the family trust. And the third category? I asked. A separate trust established by Theodore himself approximately 15 years ago, the Theodore Mitchell Legacy Trust. This entity holds intellectual property rights to his judicial writings, patent interests from investments in several technology, startups, and a significant portfolio of environmentally focused investments. I wasn't aware of this third trust, I admitted. Few people are, Elaine replied. Theodore deliberately maintained separation between his personal progressive investment activities and the more conservative family business interests. This trust has its own governance structure, with a specific focus on supporting environmental and social justice initiatives, causes I believe you share. The strategic complexity of my grandfather's financial arrangements was beginning to emerge more clearly. He had operated within the constraints of existing family structures while simultaneously creating alternative channels aligned with his personal values, and apparently, with consideration for my eventual role. How do these different structures interact with the bloodline verification Richard mentioned? I asked. Elaine's expression became more focused. This is where Theodore's legal ingenuity becomes apparent. Approximately 5 years ago, he amended both his personal will and the governance provisions of his legacy trust to include specific bloodline verification requirements for potential trustees and major beneficiaries. The language is carefully crafted to require direct biological descent from Samuel Mitchell, your great-grandfather, verified through DNA testing if contested. And Richard believes these provisions will exclude me, I said. while actually, they'll confirm my eligibility. Through Robert. Precisely, Elaine confirmed. Richard has correctly identified the existence of the provisions but misunderstood their ultimate impact in your specific case. Theodore created requirements that would appear to serve Richard's interests while actually securing yours. She leaned forward, her expression intensifying. But there's an additional layer to consider. The legacy trust provisions specifically reference direct descent rather than the more traditional male preference language in the family trust. This creates a legal argument that you, as Theodore's only direct descendant through his son Robert, have priority claim to trustee position over Richard, who descends from Theodore's brother. The implications dawned on me gradually. Are you saying I could potentially challenge Richard's position as trustee of the Mitchell family trust? It would require aggressive litigation, Elaine acknowledged. But yes, Theodore created a legal pathway for precisely that eventuality. The amended language in his personal will and legacy trust establishes precedent for reconsidering outdated succession protocols in all Mitchell family legal structures. The strategic chess game my grandfather had constructed emerged with newfound clarity. He had anticipated Richard's attempt to exclude me, and had not only created safeguards against it, but had established the foundation for a potential counteroffensive that could fundamentally reshape family power dynamics. What's your recommendation for the will reading on Friday? I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. Preparation and restraint, Elaine replied decisively. Richard expects an emotional reaction from you. Shock, hurt, perhaps public confrontation that would undermine your credibility. Instead, we'll prepare thoroughly and respond strategically. She outlined a detailed approach. I would attend with her as my legal representative. We would request formal DNA verification as specified in the will provisions rather than immediately revealing my evidence. We would position my response as measured and process-oriented rather than reactionary. Theodore always emphasized the importance of timing, Elaine noted. Revealing your full position prematurely would give Richard opportunity to develop countermeasures. Better to let him believe his strategy is succeeding while we assemble our complete response. As our meeting concluded, Elaine handed me a business card with her personal cell phone number handwritten on the back. Call anytime, day or night, if developments arise before Friday. Judge Mitchell placed enormous faith in your judgment, Ms. Mitchell. Having met you, I understand why. The vote of confidence from this accomplished professional, someone who had known and worked closely with my grandfather, steadied me as I left her office. Theodore had indeed arranged a powerful ally, exactly as his letter had promised. My next stop was the public library's genealogy department, where I spent hours researching the Mitchell family history beyond the sanitized version presented in family gatherings. The librarian, intrigued by my connection to such a prominent Boston family, provided access to archived newspapers, property records, and historical society materials. What emerged was a more complex picture of the Mitchell legacy than the one Richard so zealously guarded. Samuel Mitchell, who had established the family fortune, had been an immigrant's son who built his shipping business during wartime through government contracts, hardly the blue-blooded pedigree Richard implied. His wife, my great-grandmother, Eleanor, had been actively involved in suffragette movements, her political activism carefully omitted from family narratives Richard controlled. Most interesting were the newspaper clippings concerning my biological father, Robert. Unlike the family's portrayal of him as merely irresponsible and adventure-seeking, public records revealed his substantive environmental activism in the 1990s. He had organized protests against commercial developments threatening Massachusetts wetlands and had established one of the first investment funds specifically focused on sustainable technologies, initiatives that aligned remarkably with the environmental focus of Theodore's legacy trust. The Robert Mitchell emerging from these records was not simply the family rebel, but a man of principle whose values had apparently found continuation in the grandfather who had raised his biological daughter. This connection felt simultaneously new and deeply familiar, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally aligning to reveal a picture that had always been present but never fully visible. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. William Mitchell, the man I had believed was my father for 28 years. My breath caught as I stared at his name on the screen. What did he know? Had my mother spoken with him? Was I prepared for this conversation? I answered with forced composure. "Hi, Dad. Livy." His voice carried its usual warmth. "I've been trying to reach you. Where have you been hiding?" "Research at the library," I answered truthfully, if incompletely. "Working on a case." Also technically true, though not the professional legal case he would assume. "Always the dedicated attorney," he said with obvious affection. "Listen, your mother mentioned you two had dinner last night, and I thought perhaps we could have lunch tomorrow. There's a new Vietnamese place near campus I've been meaning to try." The casual normality of the invitation suggested my mother had maintained our agreed silence about my parentage. "That sounds perfect," I replied, surprising myself with how much I genuinely wanted to see him despite the complicated emotions swirling beneath the surface. "Excellent. Noon work for you. And Livy." He hesitated briefly. "I know this week has been difficult with Theodore's passing. He was so proud of you, you know. Perhaps the proudest I've ever seen him." The simple observation, offered without knowledge of its deeper significance, tightened my throat unexpectedly. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." After ending the call, I sat motionless among the library's archival materials, confronting the complexity of my emotional landscape. William Mitchell had raised me with consistent, if sometimes reserved, affection. Our relationship had been built on genuine care and shared intellectual interests, regardless of biological connection. The possibility of hurting him through revelations of decades-old deceptions felt acutely painful. Yet upholding my rightful place in the Mitchell legacy, the place my grandfather and biological father had apparently both wanted me to have, might eventually require bringing these truths to light. The contradiction created a moral complexity my legal training hadn't prepared me to navigate. My contemplation was interrupted by another call, this one from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Ms. Mitchell?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, professionally modulated. "My name is Jonathan Harris. I'm an associate at Mills and Barrett. Mr. Richard Mitchell suggested I contact you regarding some documentation needed before Friday's will reading." Mills and Barrett was Harrison Mills's law firm, Richard's longtime legal ally. The unsolicited contact immediately triggered my suspicion. "What documentation would that be, Mr. Harris?" I kept my tone neutral while mentally noting the conversation for later discussion with Elaine. "Just standard releases allowing the executor to begin." "Preliminary asset assessment," he explained smoothly. "Given certain complications Mr. Mitchell has mentioned regarding inheritance eligibility, he thought it might simplify matters if you voluntarily waived potential claims to contested assets." The audacity was breathtaking. Richard was attempting to secure my legal surrender before the will reading even occurred, using a junior associate to create the illusion of standard procedure. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, matching his professional tone. "However, as I'll be represented by counsel, at Friday's reading, I'll defer any documentation to that setting. Please inform Mr. Mitchell that Elaine Winters will be attending with me and will address any necessary legal matters at that time." A pause suggested this information was unexpected. "Elaine Winters? I wasn't aware you had retained separate representation." "A recent development," I confirmed. "My grandfather apparently recommended her services specifically." After ending the call, I immediately contacted Elaine to report the interaction. Her response was instructive in its controlled anger. "A completely inappropriate attempt to secure preemptive concessions," she confirmed. Document the call details immediately while they're fresh in your memory. This suggests Richard may be more concerned about his position than his confidence indicates. He's trying to prevent me from even presenting a challenge, I observed, which confirms he recognizes a potential vulnerability in his approach, Elaine noted. People who are genuinely confident in their legal position rarely resort to procedural manipulation. By late afternoon, I had completed my research and returned to my apartment in the South End, a modest one-bedroom in a converted brownstone that reflected my public interest attorney's salary rather than Mitchell family wealth. Though I had always had access to family resources for education and professional development, I had deliberately established financial independence after law school, declining Richard's repeated offers of positions within Mitchell corporate structures. That independence now seemed providential rather than merely principled. Unlike my cousins, who had built lives deeply integrated with family businesses and financial support, I had created a career and identity that could withstand whatever turbulence might result from the coming confrontation. As evening settled, over the city, a text arrived from Harrison Mills himself. I understand you've retained Elaine Winters. Perhaps we should discuss settlement options before Friday's formalities. Available tomorrow morning at my office? The overture suggested escalating concern in Richard's camp, moving from junior associate to senior partner, from procedural manipulation to settlement negotiation. They were offering concessions before even confirming my evidence or legal position. After consulting briefly with Elaine, I crafted a deliberately ambiguous response. Thank you for reaching out. Given the complexity of the situation, I believe it's most appropriate to maintain our current timeline. I look forward to Friday's proceedings. No explicit rejection, no confrontational tone, but a clear unwillingness to negotiate from an uninformed position. The strategy Elaine had outlined, measured restraint rather than reactive engagement, already seemed to be creating uncertainty in Richard's carefully constructed plans. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn to the small box of childhood mementos I kept in my bedroom closet. Among school awards and graduation programs lay the tiny wooden sailboat Robert had carved for me, a miniature replica of the vessel that would later claim his life. I had always treasured it as a gift from a rarely mentioned uncle, never imagining it represented a father's token to his unacknowledged daughter. The craftsmanship was remarkable, details meticulously rendered despite the small scale. I ran, my finger along the smooth hull, noting the carefully carved name barely visible at the stern, Olivia's Wind. The personalization suggested more than casual affection, a deliberate acknowledgement of connection within the constraints Robert had. Accepted. My phone buzzed again, my mother this time. Richard called William today, asking questions about our fertility treatments before you were born. He's digging for medical records. Be careful. The warning confirmed Richard was actively building his case, likely preparing to present documented evidence of William's infertility at the will reading. He was methodically constructing a narrative of my non-Mitchell parentage, unaware that his investigation would ultimately strengthen rather than destroy my position. I sent a quick acknowledgement to my mother, then composed a more detailed update to Elaine, who responded with characteristic strategic focus. Document everything. We'll let Richard build his case against William's paternity. It saves us the uncomfortable task of establishing that ourselves. Focus on preparing your emotional response for Friday. The legal strategy is solid, but these situations are always as much about family dynamics as legal technicalities. Her reminder of the human dimension beyond legal maneuvering was timely. Tomorrow I would face William, the father who had raised me without knowledge of our biological disconnection. Navigating that lunch while maintaining both emotional honesty and appropriate discretion would require careful balance. I placed Robert's wooden sailboat on my bedside table alongside the velvet box containing his silver pendant, tangible connections to a father I was only beginning to know through historical records and family anecdotes. Whatever came next, I was no longer navigating this turbulent sea without compass or map. Theodore had ensured I had legal guidance through Elaine. Robert had unknowingly provided confirmation of my legitimate place in the Mitchell bloodline. Even my mother, despite years of deception, had offered honest disclosure when concealment was no longer possible. As I prepared for bed, Boston's skyline glittered beyond my window, the city where generations of Mitchells had built their legacy, where my grandfather had dispensed justice from the federal bench, where my biological father had championed environmental causes before his untimely death. I was part of this lineage in ways more complex and direct than I had ever imagined. Richard had expected his revelation to devastate me, to render me powerless through shock and exclusion. Instead, it had initiated a process of discovery that was revealing not only my true heritage, but also the strategic foresight of a grandfather who had anticipated this very scenario and prepared accordingly. Friday's will reading would be merely the opening move in a game whose dimensions were becoming increasingly clear. Richard believed he was the chess master, orchestrating a carefully planned exclusion. He remained unaware that Theodore, the true grandmaster, had arranged the board long before any of us recognized the game had begun. The following morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight reflecting off fresh snow that had fallen overnight, transforming Boston into a glittering landscape of white-capped brownstones and ice-trimmed trees. I dressed with particular care for my lunch with William, selecting a deep blue sweater he had given me last Christmas and the silver sailboat pendant from Robert, a private acknowledgement of the complex reality now defining my existence. Before meeting William, I had a pressing errand, a visit to the bank where I maintained a safe deposit box. The DNA evidence and Robert's written acknowledgement of paternity needed secure storage beyond my apartment. Too much now depended on these documents to risk their loss or damage. The bank manager recognized me immediately, one benefit of being a regular customer with a recognizable family name in Boston's financial circles. "Ms. Mitchell, good morning. How can we assist you today?" "I need to access my safe deposit." "Box, please," I replied, presenting my identification and signature card. In the private viewing room, I carefully added the wooden box containing Theodore's letter and Robert's paternity acknowledgement to my existing documents: passport, birth, certificate, property deeds. As I was about to close the box, my attention caught on my birth certificate, a document I had accessed only occasionally for administrative purposes without ever examining closely. Now, with new knowledge, certain details stood out prominently. Father, William Edouard Mitchell. Mother, Catherine Anne Mitchell, née Laurence. The official record of a biological fiction, certified by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I wondered briefly who had signed the birth certificate. Had William proudly claimed paternity of his miracle child, unaware of the deception? Had my mother forged his signature to maintain their carefully constructed narrative? These questions led to another, more legally significant consideration. Was this document technically fraudulent? Could Richard potentially use this official misrepresentation as additional leverage in challenging my inheritance rights? I made a mental note to discuss this specific concern with Elaine. After securing the safe deposit box, I headed to Cambridge for my lunch with William. The Vietnamese restaurant he had suggested was typical of his preferences. Small, authentic, tucked away on a side street near Harvard where he had taught history for nearly 30 years. His lanky figure was already visible through the window when I arrived, his attention focused on a book spread open beside his water glass. Some things never changed. William Mitchell had never gone anywhere without reading material. This lifelong habit had influenced my own relationship with books long before I discovered my grandfather's rare collection. Watching him now, his silver-streaked hair falling forward as he leaned over his reading, I felt a surge of affection untethered from biological reality. This man had shaped my intellectual development, had encouraged my curiosity, had celebrated my achievements with genuine pride. Whatever DNA might dictate, these contributions to my identity remained real and significant. He looked up as I entered, his face brightening with obvious pleasure. Livy! He stood to embrace me, the familiar scent of wool and peppermint enveloping me momentarily. You look well. I was worried these past difficult days might have taken a greater toll. I'm managing, I replied, settling into the chair opposite him. Keeping busy helps. Always your strategy, even as a child, he observed with a fond smile. I remember how you organized your entire bookshelf by subject and color after your goldfish died, processing grief through order and activity. The casual observation, evidence of his attentive parenting across 28 years, created an unexpected lump in my throat. This man knew me, had studied my developmental patterns with scholarly interest and paternal affection. The absence of biological connection didn't negate that history of attention and care. How are you holding up? I asked, deliberately shifting focus. You and Grandpa were close in your own way. William nodded, his expression thoughtful. Theodore and I understood each other, I think. Neither of us quite fit Richard's vision of proper Mitchell men. Me with my academic pursuits, Theodore with his progressive judicial philosophy. We found common ground in our appreciation for ideas over acquisitions. This characterization aligned with my own understanding of both men, their shared intellectual curiosity, their willingness to challenge conventional thinking, their appreciation for nuance and complexity. These traits had shaped my own development, far more than the business acumen Richard so valued in his sons. As we ordered and began our meal, William's conversation remained casual, touching on university politics, recent books, and neighborhood developments. No hint of suspicion or confrontation emerged, confirming my mother's assessment that Richard's inquiries hadn't yet raised significant concerns. I saw Richard briefly yesterday, William mentioned as our food arrived. He seemed particularly focused on the will reading tomorrow. Mentioned something about significant reorganization of family assets. I maintained neutral expression despite internal alarm. Did he elaborate? No, and I didn't press. Richard has always treated Theodore's financial decisions as his exclusive domain. William's tone carried mild irritation. As if my disinterest in maximizing profit margins rendered me incapable of understanding basic inheritance structures. This dismissive treatment by Richard, apparently extended to all three brothers over decades, explained some of William's habitual withdrawal from family business matters. It wasn't merely academic distraction, but a learned response to systematic marginalization. Will you attend the reading? I asked. Of course. Whatever Theodore's decisions regarding material assets, his final wishes deserve respectful attention from all family members. He paused, studying me with sudden intensity. Richard seemed particularly interested in your attendance, almost concerned about it. Is there something specific I should know about? The direct question created a momentary crisis. Complete honesty would require revealing painful truths William didn't deserve to face in a public restaurant. Complete deception would betray the thoughtful relationship we had always maintained. I opted for partial truth. Richard and I had a disagreement about Grandpa's intentions regarding certain assets. He believes some provisions of the will may affect my standing differently than he initially assumed. William's expression sharpened. Behind his scholarly demeanor lay a keen analytical mind, one that had specialized in historical power dynamics and succession conflicts. That sounds deliberately vague, Livy. What specific standing is at issue? The directness of his question deserved reciprocal honesty, even if incomplete. Richard has raised questions about bloodline succession provisions in the Mitchell Trust. He believes certain inheritance qualifications may apply differently to different family members. Understanding dawned visibly in William's eyes, not the full truth, but enough to recognize Richard's likely approach. The antiquated patrilineal provisions? Those were established generations ago under very different social conditions. Surely Theodore wouldn't reinforce such outdated structures. That remains to be seen, I replied carefully. William leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the restaurant's ambient noise. Livy, is Richard attempting to limit your inheritance based on gender? Because that would be not only morally reprehensible but potentially legally questionable under current trust law. The misinterpretation provided momentary relief. William had constructed a plausible explanation that allowed immediate alliance without revealing the more complicated truth. Richard's sexism was well established enough to make this assumption entirely credible. He's exploring various technical approaches to maximize his control of family assets, I confirmed, maintaining literal truth while allowing William's misconception to stand temporarily. Elaine Winters will be representing me at the reading to ensure my interests are properly protected. Elaine Winters, William repeated, recognition evident. Theodore's former clerk. Brilliant choice. She understands both the legal complexities and the family dynamics involved. He reached across the table to cover my hand with his. Whatever Richard attempts, know that you have allies. Catherine and I will support whatever measures necessary to ensure fair treatment. The unconditional support, offered without complete information, both warmed and troubled me. William's loyalty remained steadfast, despite unknowingly standing on shifting familial ground. I squeezed his hand in response, making a silent promise to protect him from unnecessary pain while ensuring justice prevailed. Our conversation shifted to lighter topics for the remainder of lunch, though I noticed William observing me with thoughtful attention, likely cataloging subtle changes in my demeanor. His historian's training made him particularly attuned to discrepancies and pattern disruptions, a professional habit that had sometimes made childhood fibs impossible to maintain. As we parted outside the restaurant, his embrace felt particularly meaningful. Theodore believed absolutely in your capabilities, Livy, he said quietly. Whatever challenges tomorrow brings, remember that. The simple affirmation, unknowingly, echoing Theodore's written encouragement, strengthened my resolve. Whatever complicated truths might eventually emerge, I would navigate them with the same integrity and careful consideration both these men had demonstrated throughout their diverse approaches to the Mitchell legacy. Back in my apartment, I found an unexpected package waiting outside my door. A legal-sized envelope with no return address, my name handwritten in unfamiliar script. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be internal notes from Harrison Mills's law firm regarding Mitchell Trust succession contingencies. The document outlined potential arguments against non-paternal claimants, with specific reference to DNA verification requirements and judicial precedents regarding legitimate inheritance claims. Most significantly, the document referenced RM contingency planning, a direct reference to Robert Mitchell that suggested Richard and Harrison were at least considering the possibility of my connection to Robert rather than treating it as entirely unknown. A yellow sticky note attached to the document bore a simple message. Not everyone at M&B agrees with these tactics. Friday, 10 a.m. Anonymous delivery of confidential legal documents raised complex ethical questions. The materials potentially constituted stolen proprietary information, yet they also revealed preparation for potentially fraudulent legal arguments against my legitimate inheritance rights. Accepting and using such information could create vulnerability in my own legal position. I immediately contacted Elaine, describing the materials without drawing direct conclusions. This development requires careful handling, she advised after considering the implications. The documents themselves are problematic from an evidentiary standpoint, but the information they contain is valuable intelligence about Richard's potential strategy. Knowing they're considering the Robert connection changes our approach. Should we revise our strategy for tomorrow? I asked. Not fundamentally, Elaine replied, but this confirms we should be prepared for multiple scenarios, including the possibility that Richard already suspects your true paternity and has prepared counterarguments. We'll need to adjust our evidence presentation sequence accordingly. With this new development in mind, I spent the afternoon meticulously preparing for the will reading, reviewing notes from my grandfather's letter, organizing questions for various scenarios, and mentally rehearsing responses to potential challenges. Elaine had emphasized the importance of maintaining composed professionalism regardless of provocations, noting that emotional reactions would play directly into Richard's strategy of portraying me as unstable or irrational. As evening approached, another text arrived from my mother. Richard requested access to medical records from my fertility treatments. The doctor's office called for verification. What should I tell them? After consulting briefly with Elaine, I advised transparency. Allow the records release. Those documents will actually support our position by confirming William's infertility. Richard is building our case for us. This strategic approach, allowing Richard to construct the foundation for my claim while remaining unaware of its ultimate implications, reflected Theodore's own methodology. My grandfather had always believed in letting opponents reveal their strategies before countering with unexpected approaches. The best chess players, he often told me, win not by making perfect moves, but by inducing imperfect ones from their opponents. That night, unable to sleep despite physical exhaustion, I found myself drawn to my small balcony overlooking Boston's South End. The city stretched before me, windows illuminated against the darkness, each light representing lives unfolding in their own complex patterns. Somewhere across that urban landscape, Richard was likely making final preparations for what he believed would be his definitive consolidation of control over the Mitchell legacy. He remained unaware that Theodore had arranged a countermove from beyond the grave, a strategic revelation that would transform apparent vulnerability into unexpected strength. The coming confrontation would require not just legal evidence, but moral clarity about the ultimate purpose of the Mitchell resources. What did I truly want from this inheritance beyond merely defeating Richard's manipulations? The question deserved serious consideration beyond reactive defense of my position. If successful, I would potentially control significant financial and cultural assets, a responsibility requiring purposeful vision rather than merely preserved status. My grandfather's careful structuring of his legacy trust provided important clues to his own intentions: environmental initiatives, social justice investments, progressive applications of traditional wealth. These priorities aligned with values I had developed independently throughout my legal career, suggesting an inheritance more meaningful than merely financial. Theodore had seen something in me worth protecting through elaborate legal mechanisms, not just familial affection, but shared principles and approaches to privilege and responsibility. Whatever the outcome of tomorrow's proceedings, honoring that recognition meant advancing those principles rather than merely securing personal benefit. With this renewed clarity of purpose, I finally returned inside and managed a few hours of restless sleep before dawn broke on what promised to be one of the most consequential days of my life. Friday morning arrived with steely gray skies and temperature low enough to make breath visible in crystalline clouds. I dressed with deliberate care, a charcoal gray suit professional enough for serious legal proceedings, yet distinctly feminine, in contrast to the traditional male-dominated Mitchell business aesthetic. The silver sailboat pendant from Robert completed the ensemble, a private acknowledgement of heritage visible for those with knowledge to recognize its significance. Elaine met me outside the offices of Mills and Barrett, her confident presence immediately stabilizing. "Remember," she said quietly as we rode the elevator to the conference room floor, "this is merely the opening gambit. Regardless of today's specific developments, we maintain strategic perspective on the longer process." Theodore's provisions were designed for eventual rather than immediate resolution. The elevator doors opened to reveal Richard already waiting in the reception area, flanked by his two sons, Charles and Thomas, both in their early 30s, both embodying the Mitchell corporate aesthetic in identical navy suits and regimental ties. Richard's expression betrayed momentary surprise at Elaine's presence before settling into practiced neutrality. "Olivia," he acknowledged with minimal courtesy. "I see you've brought representation." "Good morning, Richard," I replied evenly. "Yes, Elaine Winters will be assisting me today. I believe you're acquainted." The subtle tension between them suggested previous professional encounters, unsurprising given Boston's relatively close-knit legal community. Elaine offered a precisely calibrated professional nod, neither hostile nor particularly warm. "Of course," Richard responded. "Ms. Winters's reputation precedes her, though I confess surprise at her involvement in what should be straightforward family business. Judge Mitchell specifically recommended Ms. Winters's expertise for these proceedings," I noted, establishing Theodore's direct connection to my legal representation. He valued her understanding of complex trust structures. Before Richard could respond, the conference room doors opened to reveal Harrison Mills, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, embodying decades of establishment legal practice. "The executor is ready to begin," he announced with formal precision. "If everyone would please take their seats." The Mitchell family filed into the wood-paneled conference room. Richard and his sons, William and my mother, several cousins from extended family branches, and finally, Elaine and myself. Harrison's paralegal distributed folders containing summary documents to each attendee, while Harrison himself arranged materials at the head of the conference table. William took a seat beside me, offering a reassuring smile that confirmed his continuing support despite incomplete understanding of the situation. My mother sat opposite, her composure maintained through visible effort, her gaze occasionally flickering toward Richard with barely concealed apprehension. Once everyone was settled, Harrison cleared his throat with practiced authority. "We are gathered to execute the last will and testament of Theodore Mitchell, pursuant to filing requirements of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and governing documents of the Mitchell Family Trust. Before proceeding with specific provisions, I must address certain preliminary matters regarding succession eligibility." The calculated opening confirmed Richard's influence. Beginning with eligibility questions rather than direct will provisions positioned my status as problematic from the outset. Harrison continued, his tone suggesting reluctant obligation. "It has come to the executor's attention that certain beneficiaries named in Theodore Mitchell's will may not qualify under bloodline provisions established in the original Mitchell Family Trust and reinforced in subsequent amendments. These provisions require beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Mitchell line." Richard straightened imperceptibly, satisfaction evident despite his maintained professionalism. William shifted beside me, confusion giving way to dawning concern as he processed the implications of Harrison's statement. "Specifically," Harrison continued, removing a document from his portfolio, "we have documentation confirming that Olivia Mitchell, while legally recognized as William Mitchell's daughter, is not his biological child." A murmur rippled through the assembled family members. William's posture stiffened beside me, his expression transitioning from confusion to shock as he turned toward me with questioning eyes. My mother's face drained of color despite her prior knowledge of this revelation, the public disclosure clearly more difficult than she had anticipated. Harrison placed medical records on the table. "These fertility treatment records from Massachusetts. General Hospital confirm that William Mitchell was diagnosed with medical conditions rendering biological paternity impossible. Additional DNA analysis commissioned by the executor confirms with 97% certainty that William Mitchell is not Olivia Mitchell's biological father." William's hand found mine beneath the table, squeezing with intensity that conveyed both shock and instinctive support, despite the devastating personal revelation. His whispered, "Livy?" carried confusion, hurt, and concern simultaneously. "I'm sorry," I whispered back. "We'll talk after." Harrison continued methodically. "Under normal circumstances, this evidence would be sufficient to exclude Olivia, Mitchell from provisions specifically designated for blood descendants of the Mitchell line. However, "That's absurd," William interrupted, finding his voice despite evident emotional turmoil. "Theodore explicitly included Olivia in family affairs throughout his life. Whatever biological technicalities might exist, his intentions regarding her inclusion were absolutely clear." Richard's carefully composed expression revealed a hint of sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "We're merely following Theodore's own stipulations, William. The bloodline verification requirements were his addition to the will, not our interpretation. If anyone chose to exclude Olivia based on paternity, it was Theodore himself." The calculated cruelty of this assertion, designed to suggest my grandfather's rejection rather than his protection, momentarily threatened my composure. Elaine's steady presence beside me provided essential grounding as Harrison prepared to continue. The stage was set precisely as Theodore had anticipated. Richard had successfully established my non-relationship to William, while remaining unaware of the Robert connection that would transform these very provisions from exclusionary to confirmatory. The next moments would determine whether my grandfather's careful planning would succeed in its ultimate objective, not merely securing my inheritance, but establishing my legitimate place in the Mitchell legacy against those who sought to deny it. The conference room fell into tense silence following Richard's calculated assertion that my grandfather had intended my exclusion. I maintained composed neutrality despite the emotional impact of his words, allowing Harrison Mills to continue with the proceedings. Beside me, William remained rigid with shock, his worldview visibly crumbling as decades of assumed paternity dissolved in a clinical recitation of medical records. "As I was about to explain," Harrison continued, "there are additional considerations regarding bloodline verification that must be addressed. Theodore Mitchell's will contains specific directives regarding the process for determining legitimate succession in contested cases." Harrison extracted another document from his portfolio, adjusting his reading glasses with deliberate precision. "The will stipulates that in cases where bloodline eligibility is questioned, DNA verification must be conducted according to specific protocols outlined in Section 7, Paragraph 3. These protocols require comparison against verified Mitchell family DNA samples maintained in secure storage at Boston Memorial Hospital's Genetic Research Department. This detail, the existence of stored Mitchell DNA samples, was new information to me. Theodore's letter had mentioned only the hair samples from Robert he had preserved personally, not an institutional repository of family genetic material. I glanced at Elaine, whose subtle nod suggested this development aligned with our strategy despite its surprise element. Richard leaned forward, confidence evident in his relaxed posture. "I've already initiated the verification process, Harrison. Preliminary results confirm what we've established. Olivia shows no genetic connection to William Mitchell. The more comprehensive panel should be available next week, but given the clarity of existing evidence, I suggest we proceed with provisional distribution of uncontested assets while reserving bloodline-restricted portions pending final confirmation." "Actually," Harrison replied with uncharacteristic firmness, "Theodore's instructions are quite specific regarding the sequence of proceedings. No distributions may commence until bloodline verification is complete for all named beneficiaries. This includes you, Richard, as well as your sons." Richard's expression flickered with momentary confusion before settling into irritated compliance. "Of course, though I hardly think my position is in question." Theodore was quite insistent that proper procedure be followed regardless of presumed outcomes, Harrison noted, a new note of independence emerging in his tone. "All potential beneficiaries must submit to verification testing before any distributions can be finalized." This procedural requirement, apparently unexpected by Richard, suggested additional dimensions to Theodore's strategy that hadn't been evident from his letter to me. My grandfather had created multiple layers of protection and verification, ensuring that Richard's attack on my eligibility would necessarily subject his own position to equal scrutiny. Now, Harrison continued, returning to his formal executor role, regarding Ms. Mitchell's status, the will contains an important contingency provision. He selected another document from his materials. In the event that William Mitchell is determined not to be Olivia Mitchell's biological father, Theodore directed that comparative DNA analysis be conducted against all male Mitchell line members of appropriate generation to determine potential paternity. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the conference room. Richard's carefully maintained composure fractured visibly as he processed the implications. That's preposterous. Why would Theodore request such an invasive and speculative procedure? Harrison responded with professional detachment. I cannot speak to Judge Mitchell's reasoning, only to his explicit instructions. The provision specifically states that, given the Mitchell family's established pattern of internal complexity, comprehensive verification ensures appropriate recognition of legitimate bloodline connections, regardless of previously documented legal relationships. The carefully crafted language, clearly Theodore's own phrasing, contained layers of meaning that resonated differently across the assembled family members. To most, it likely suggested merely thorough legal procedure. To those with knowledge of my true parentage, it represented Theodore's strategic pathway to establishing my legitimate Mitchell heritage through Robert, rather than William. Richard's expression darkened as he recognized a potential threat to his calculated strategy. This seems unnecessarily intrusive into private family matters. Surely a simple exclusion of non-blood relatives would suffice without subjecting uninvolved family members to genetic scrutiny. The instructions are unambiguous, Harrison replied, his tone suggesting growing impatience with Richard's objections. All male Mitchell line members of appropriate generation must provide samples for comparison. That would include you, Richard, as Theodore's nephew and potential father of a child born during the relevant time frame. The implication that Richard himself might potentially be my biological father created a ripple of shocked murmurs around the table. My mother's expression registered appropriate outrage at the suggestion, while William appeared increasingly disoriented by each new revelation. "This is absurd," Richard snapped, abandoning his previous composure. "I had no relationship whatsoever with Catherine during that period. I'm merely explaining the procedural requirements outlined in Judge Mitchell's will," Harrison responded, his professional demeanor firmly reinstated. "The testing will determine biological relationships objectively, without presumption or accusation." Theodore was very clear that comprehensive verification was essential to proper execution of his wishes. At this point, Elaine spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. "If I may, Mr. Mills, does Judge Mitchell's will specify a timeline for this verification process? Given the significance of these provisions to all parties, establishing a clear procedural schedule seems essential." Her intervention, strategically timed and framed as procedural clarification, redirected attention from emotionally charged implications to practical next steps. Harrison appeared visibly relieved at the shift toward legal technicalities. "Indeed, Ms. Winters, the will stipulates that verification testing must be completed within 30 days of the initial reading, with results certified by independent genetic analysts at Boston University Medical Center. Until this process is complete, all assets remain under executor control with maintenance provisions for ongoing management requirements." Richard's calculation was clearly visible. He was assessing whether to challenge these procedural requirements directly or to comply while developing alternative strategies. After a moment's consideration, he adopted a tone of reasonable accommodation. "While I find these requirements somewhat excessive, I respect Theodore's right to establish verification protocols for his estate. My sons and I will certainly comply with the testing requirements. I assume scheduling can be arranged at mutual convenience through your office, Harrison." "My staff will coordinate appointments beginning Monday," Harrison confirmed. "Now, with procedural matters addressed, We proceed to the provisional overview of estate components pending verification outcomes. The remainder of the will reading proceeded with surprisingly little drama, given the bombshell revelations of its opening. Harrison outlined Theodore's estate in 3 distinct categories, as Elaine had previously explained. The Mitchell family. Trust assets, governed by traditional bloodline succession. Theodore's personal estate, including the Beacon Hill home, art collection, and financial investments, and the Theodore Mitchell Legacy Trust focused on environmental and social justice initiatives. Without specifying final distributions pending DNA verification, Harrison outlined general provisions. The family trust would continue under trustee management with distributions to verified bloodline descendants. The personal estate would be divided according to specific bequests detailed in separate documents, and the legacy trust would transition to new trustee governance according to qualifications outlined in its charter. Throughout this overview, Richard maintained attentive composure while occasionally exchanging glances with his sons that suggested ongoing strategic assessment. William remained in apparent shock beside me, his academic mind visibly struggling to integrate these revelations into his understanding of family history. My mother alternated between careful attention to procedural details and anxious observation of William's reactions. As the initial reading concluded, Harrison addressed final administrative matters regarding property maintenance and ongoing business operations during the verification period. Unless there are specific questions regarding procedural matters, this concludes today's formal reading. Individual consultation sessions regarding specific provisions can be scheduled through my office next week. Richard was the first to rise, gathering his materials with efficient movements that conveyed both control and urgency. Harrison, I'd like to review the complete verification protocols this afternoon if possible. There are procedural questions that require clarification. My office is available at 2, Harrison replied neutrally, though the protocols are explicitly detailed in Theodore's documentation. As family members began dispersing, William turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, confusion, and concern. Livy, I think we need to talk. Perhaps at the house? Your mother should join us. Of course, I agreed, recognizing the inevitability of this conversation. I'll follow you there directly. Elaine touched my arm lightly as William moved toward the door. Call me afterward. The developments with the verification protocols actually strengthen our position, but timing becomes more critical. I nodded acknowledgement before gathering my materials. As I prepared to leave, Richard approached, his expression carefully modulated into something approaching conciliatory concern. Olivia, despite the complicated nature of today's revelations, I want to assure you that family connections extend beyond mere biology. Whatever the verification process determines, you retain your place in the broader Mitchell family context, if not in the formal inheritance structures. The calculated performance, offering emotional inclusion while maintaining financial exclusion, was precisely calibrated to appear generous while conceding nothing of substance. I maintained neutral professionalism in my response. Thank you for that clarification, Richard. I look forward to the verification process providing objective determination of all familial connections as Grandpa Theodore intended. Something in my phrasing, perhaps the confidence underlying my seemingly procedural acceptance, triggered visible reassessment in Richard's expression. Theodore's procedural requirements are certainly thorough, if somewhat excessive. Still, clarity serves everyone's interests ultimately. Indeed, I agreed. Comprehensive truth benefits the entire family, regardless of previously assumed relationships. His eyes narrowed slightly at this echo of Theodore's phrasing before he nodded curtly and moved toward his waiting sons. The subtle shift in his demeanor suggested dawning concern that Theodore's verification requirements might serve purposes beyond those initially apparent. Outside the law offices, Boston's winter landscape reflected my internal state. Bright clarity cutting through the morning chill, illuminating familiar structures from new angles that revealed previously unnoticed details. The Mitchell family dynamics had functioned for decades within carefully maintained boundaries of partial truth. Theodore's carefully constructed will had fractured those boundaries, allowing long-hidden realities to emerge with inevitable momentum. I drove to the Mitchell family home in Beacon Hill with growing apprehension about the conversation awaiting me. William deserved complete honesty after today's public revelations, yet the full truth would necessarily cause additional pain I'd hoped to spare him. The complexity of these competing ethical considerations, honesty versus compassion, exemplified the moral challenges underlying the entire inheritance situation. The Mitchell home stood as it had for generations, a stately federal-style mansion projecting stability and permanence amid changing urban surroundings. Today, it felt like a stage set for the unfolding family drama, its elegant facade concealing decades of complicated relationships and strategic accommodations. William answered my knock immediately, suggesting he had been watching for my arrival. His scholarly composure had partially returned, though strain remained visible around his eyes as he led me to the library where my mother waited. The room, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather furnishings, had hosted countless family discussions over decades, though perhaps none as fundamentally transformative as what was about to occur. My mother rose as we entered, her expression apprehensive, yet resolved. "Olivia, William has asked me to explain everything from the beginning. Before I do, is there anything you'd like to say first?" The question offered me control of the narrative, a consideration that reflected her maternal protective instinct, despite the circumstances. I appreciated the gesture, but recognized William's right to direct disclosure after decades of unknowing participation in a complex deception. "I think William deserves to hear the complete truth directly from you," I replied gently. "I learned most of it only 2 days ago myself." William settled into his usual armchair, his academic training evident in his approach to emotional turmoil, seeking comprehensive information before forming conclusions. "Catherine, I need to understand exactly what happened, not just regarding Olivia's paternity, but why this deception was maintained for nearly 3 decades. My mother nodded, drawing a steadying breath before beginning her explanation. She recounted the fertility challenges they had faced, William's devastating diagnosis of infertility, and the brief connection with Robert during this period of mutual vulnerability. Her account matched what Theodore's letter had revealed, though with greater emotional detail regarding the impact of these events on all participants. "Robert came to me immediately afterward, consumed by guilt," she explained, her voice steady despite evident difficulty. "He loved you, William. The idea of betraying you destroyed him. When I discovered I was pregnant weeks later, the 3 of us, Robert, Theodore, and I, made a decision we believed would protect everyone involved. You would believe the medical diagnosis had been wrong, that a miracle had occurred." William listened with remarkable composure, his historian's analytical mind visibly processing this revision of his personal narrative. "Theodore knew from the beginning?" he asked, focusing initially on his father's role rather than the more emotionally charged aspects of the revelation. "Yes," my mother confirmed. "Robert confessed everything to him immediately. Theodore believed the arrangement would preserve family stability while protecting everyone involved, you from unnecessary pain, Robert from the consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment, and Olivia from complicated family dynamics. And when Robert died, William's question cut to a critical transition point in the narrative. The secret became even more permanently sealed, my mother replied. With Robert gone, revealing the truth seemed unnecessarily destructive without serving any constructive purpose. William absorbed this explanation in silence, his gaze eventually shifting to me. "And you, Livy? When did you learn about this?" 2 days ago, I answered honestly. Richard confronted me with his discovery that I wasn't your biological child, intending to exclude me from the inheritance on that basis. he didn't know, still doesn't know, that Robert is my biological father. But Theodore left you a letter, William noted, his analytical mind assembling the timeline. He anticipated this situation. Yes, he knew Richard would eventually discover enough of the truth to challenge my position. The letter explained my true paternity and provided evidence to establish my legitimate Mitchell bloodline through Robert. William nodded slowly, processing the strategic dimensions alongside the personal implications. Theodore's verification protocols suddenly make perfect sense. He created a mechanism to establish your connection to Robert without requiring public disclosure of painful history unless absolutely necessary. His perception confirmed the academic brilliance that had always defined him, the ability to recognize complex patterns within seemingly disparate information. Despite his personal emotional stake, he was already analyzing Theodore's strategic approach with scholarly appreciation. "I'm so sorry, William," my mother said softly, tears finally breaking through her composed exterior. "We never intended to hurt you." The deception began with what seemed like genuine kindness and became impossible to unravel as years passed. William regarded her with an expression I couldn't fully interpret. Pain, certainly, but also something more complex than simple anger or betrayal. 28 years of marriage based on a fundamental deception, Catherine. A life built around what I believed was our miracle child. The quiet devastation in his voice affected me more powerfully than any shouted accusation could have. This gentle, thoughtful man had structured his entire adult life around beliefs that were now revealed as carefully constructed fictions. "I understand if you can never forgive this," my mother acknowledged, her voice breaking. "But please know that my love for you has been genuine throughout our marriage, despite its complicated beginnings." William turned toward me, his expression softening despite his evident inner turmoil. "And you, Livy, how are you processing all of this? To discover your entire identity has been different than you believed." His immediate concern for my emotional well-being despite his own crisis exemplified the generous spirit that had defined our relationship throughout my life. This essential quality, placing others' needs alongside his own, even in moments of personal pain, transcended biological connection entirely. "I'm still integrating it," I answered honestly. "Learning about Robert, understanding Grandpa's protective strategies, recognizing patterns I never noticed before. But one thing remains absolutely clear to me. You have been my father in every meaningful sense of that word, regardless of biology." William's eyes filled with tears at this affirmation. "I have loved you as my daughter from the moment you were born, Livy. That hasn't changed with these revelations." The simple declaration, offered without qualification despite the seismic disruption of his understanding, created a moment of genuine connection amidst the complicated truths surrounding us. Whatever Theodore's strategic planning and Richard's calculated maneuvering, this human relationship remained authentic, despite its foundation in partial truth. We talked for hours, moving from initial revelations through complex implications toward tentative understanding of the path forward. William's scholarly mind processed the inheritance implications alongside the personal dimensions, recognizing Theodore's careful construction of verification protocols as protection rather than manipulation. "Richard has seriously miscalculated," William observed as our conversation shifted toward strategic considerations. "He assumed revealing your non-connection to me would exclude you from the Mitchell bloodline entirely. Instead, it activates Theodore's verification mechanism that will establish your direct connection to Robert, and through him, a stronger bloodline claim than Richard himself can assert." The analysis confirmed Elaine's assessment of our strengthened position following today's developments. Theodore's verification requirements would provide independently certified confirmation of exactly what Richard had tried to disprove: my legitimate place in the Mitchell bloodline. As afternoon faded toward evening, practical considerations emerged regarding immediate next steps. William would need time and space to process these revelations, particularly regarding his marriage. My mother understood this necessity without resentment, agreeing to temporarily relocate to her Cambridge apartment while maintaining open communication. "Whatever happens between us, Catherine," William said as this arrangement was discussed, "we need to present a united front regarding Olivia's position in the family. Richard cannot be allowed to manipulate these personal matters for financial advantage." The principled commitment, placing family loyalty above personal hurt, reflected the moral foundation that had always distinguished William from Richard's more transactional approach to relationships. Even in profound personal crisis, his ethical compass remained steadfastly oriented toward justice rather than self-interest. As I prepared to leave, William embraced me with particular intensity. "You are my daughter in every way that truly matters, Livy," he whispered. "These revelations change history but not reality. Remember that in the difficult days ahead." Driving back to my apartment through Boston's evening traffic, I found myself reflecting on the day's extraordinary developments with newfound clarity. What had begun as Richard's calculated attempt to exclude me from my inheritance had instead initiated a process that would ultimately strengthen my position within the Mitchell legacy. Theodore's strategic foresight had transformed apparent vulnerability into unexpected advantage through careful preparation and precise timing. More importantly, the human connections underlying these legal and financial machinations had demonstrated resilience despite decades of complicated truths. William's immediate affirmation of our father-daughter relationship, despite biological revelation, reflected authentic love transcending technical definitions of family. My mother's willingness to finally speak complete truth after decades of protective concealment demonstrated courage when alternatives might have seemed easier. Even Richard, in his manipulative approach to family governance, revealed important truths about power, control, and the darker potentials of family legacy when divorced from ethical foundation. His strategy, weaponizing biological truth while ignoring deeper realities of relationship and responsibility, illustrated precisely why Theodore had structured his estate to prioritize character and values alongside technical bloodline considerations. As I entered my apartment, the silver sailboat pendant seemed to catch the evening light with particular significance. This symbol of connection to a father I had never known now represented not just biological heritage, but a more complex legacy. One that included Theodore's strategic protection, William's devoted parenting, and my own emerging responsibility to ensure the Mitchell resources served purposes aligned with genuine family values rather than mere accumulation and control. The verification process ahead would establish scientific truth about genetic connections, but the more meaningful verification had already begun, a testing of character, values, and vision that would ultimately determine the true inheritors of the Mitchell legacy beyond mere DNA or legal technicalities. In this deeper verification, Richard's approach had already revealed critical deficiencies despite his apparent tactical advantages. Theodore had understood this essential truth when constructing his elaborate protective mechanisms. The Mitchell legacy wasn't primarily about financial assets or social position, but about values, vision, and responsibility. The true inheritance wasn't contained in trusts or property deeds, but in the capacity to steward resources toward meaningful impact beyond personal benefit. As I prepared for the challenges ahead, I felt a growing sense of purpose beyond merely defending my position against Richard's machinations. The Mitchell resources, properly directed, could support environmental initiatives, social justice, and cultural preservation aligned with values Theodore, Robert, and William had prioritized. Throughout their diverse approaches to the family legacy, this broader vision transformed the inheritance battle from personal defense to principled responsibility. The verification process Theodore had so carefully constructed would establish not just biological truth, but moral clarity about appropriate stewardship of the Mitchell legacy for generations to come. The weekend following the will reading provided essential time for strategic planning and emotional processing. I spent Saturday morning in conversation with Elaine, reviewing the unexpected developments from Friday's proceedings and calibrating our approach to the verification process that would begin Monday. Theodore's verification protocols are even more comprehensive than I anticipated, Elaine observed as we analyzed the complete documentation Harrison had provided following the reading. He established an independent review committee at Boston University Medical Center with specific expertise in genetic verification for inheritance disputes. That level of preparation suggests he anticipated exactly this scenario, I noted, continuing to be impressed by my grandfather's foresight. More than anticipated, he essentially orchestrated it, Elaine replied. By including these specific verification requirements in his will, Theodore created a mechanism that transforms Richard's challenge into your strongest evidence. It's masterful legal strategy. The scientific verification process would require samples from all male Mitchell line members of appropriate generation, including Richard, his sons, and any preserved samples from deceased family members, including Robert and Theodore himself. The committee would conduct comprehensive genetic analysis to determine precise familial relationships among all tested individuals, with results certified by multiple independent experts. Richard will be looking for ways to challenge these procedures or manipulate the results, Elaine warned. We should anticipate possible interference at every stage. What specific vulnerabilities should we watch for? I asked, determined to prepare for any contingency. Access to Robert's preserved samples is the most obvious concern, Elaine replied. Theodore indicated he maintained hair samples among Robert's personal effects, but we have no guarantee these remain available or uncompromised. The comparison against medical repository samples will be essential backup verification. We developed a detailed monitoring strategy for each phase of the verification process: sample collection, chain of custody procedures, testing protocols, and results certification. Elaine would designate a member of her firm to observe each critical step, ensuring Richard couldn't influence procedures or findings through his considerable connections. What about William? I asked, concern for his emotional well-being rising alongside strategic considerations. This process will be painful for him regardless of outcome. Elaine's expression softened momentarily. That's a personal rather than legal consideration, Olivia. But in my experience, transparency about process while being sensitive about details often helps in such situations. William should understand what's happening without being unnecessarily confronted with painful specifics. This balanced approach, honesty without cruelty, aligned with my own instincts regarding William's involvement. He deserved complete transparency about the verification process itself, while being spared unnecessary details that would only deepen his pain without serving constructive purpose. Later that afternoon, I visited the Mitchell family archives housed in the Beacon Hill Mansion's basement, a climate-controlled room containing generations of family documents, photographs, and personal effects. As Theodore's granddaughter, I had always had access to these materials, though I had rarely explored them beyond specific research projects during my law school years. Now I approached these archives with new purpose, seeking deeper understanding of Robert Mitchell beyond the simplified narrative that had dominated family discussions. William had provided his key to the archives without question, his academic respect for research and discovery transcending personal discomfort with the circumstances. Historical context matters, he had said simply when providing the key. Understanding Robert as a person rather than merely a biological contributor will be important for you. The Mitchell archives were organized with meticulous precision. Each generation assigned specific sections with materials categorized by type and chronological sequence. Robert's section was noticeably smaller than his brother's, reflecting his shorter life and the family's tendency to minimize his presence in official narratives after his death. The materials I discovered revealed dimensions of Robert Mitchell, entirely absent from family discussions. Beyond the simplistic characterization as the family rebel, documentation showed a man of principle whose differences with family expectations stemmed from genuine conviction rather than mere rebelliousness. His environmental activism was substantiated through newspaper clippings, documenting protests against commercial development projects threatening Massachusetts wetlands in the early 1990s. Personal correspondence revealed thoughtful engagement with emerging environmental science and passionate advocacy for sustainable business practices long before such concepts became mainstream. Most revealing were journals spanning his early 20s, handwritten volumes filled with reflections on purpose, responsibility, and the ethical obligations attached to inherited privilege. One passage particularly resonated as I considered my current circumstances. The Mitchell name opens doors, but what matters is what I bring through those doors once opened. Wealth without purpose is mere accumulation. Influence without principle is simply domination. The true inheritance isn't assets, but responsibility, the obligation to direct resources toward meaningful impact beyond self-interest. These words, written by a father I had never known, articulated precisely the emerging framework for my own approach to the Mitchell legacy. The coincidence of perspective across generations and despite absence of direct influence suggested something more fundamental than mere genetic connection, a shared ethical orientation toward privilege and responsibility that transcended both nature and nurture explanations. Among Robert's personal effects, I discovered additional photographs beyond the formal portraits displayed in family spaces, casual images showing a young man with infectious enthusiasm and genuine warmth. In several, he appeared alongside Theodore, their shared expressions suggesting mutual understanding despite different temperaments and approaches. Most poignantly, I found a small collection of newspaper clippings tracking William's academic achievements, articles Robert had apparently preserved despite their strained relationship following the situation with my mother. This evidence of continued care for his brother's accomplishments complicated the simplified narrative of family relationships I had inherited. The archives also contained extensive materials regarding Theodore's judicial career and personal philanthropy, much of which I had previously studied but now revisited with fresh perspective. His judicial writings revealed consistent emphasis on ethical principles transcending technical legal requirements, particularly in cases involving environmental protection and resource stewardship. His philanthropic activities, documented through foundation reports and correspondence, showed strategic focus on initiatives promoting sustainable development, educational access, and community resilience, priorities aligned with Robert's environmental activism and distinct from Richard's more traditional business-centered approach to family legacy. What emerged from this archival exploration was a clearer understanding of the philosophical divide underlying the current inheritance conflict. The Mitchell legacy contained two distinct visions: Richard's emphasis on accumulation, control, and traditional prestige versus the more progressive, impact-focused approach Theodore had shared with Robert, and that now resonated with my own developing perspective. The inheritance dispute wasn't merely about financial assets or technical bloodline qualifications, but about which vision would guide the Mitchell resources moving forward. Theodore's carefully constructed verification process would establish my biological connection to the Mitchell bloodline through Robert, but the more meaningful verification concerned alignment with the values and vision he had prioritized throughout his stewardship of the family legacy. Sunday morning brought an unexpected invitation from William to join him for breakfast at his favorite Cambridge Cafe, a small establishment near Harvard where he had been a regular patron for decades. The neutral location suggested his desire for conversation outside the emotionally charged environment of the family home. He appeared remarkably composed given the circumstances, his academic discipline evident in his approach to processing life-altering revelations. After initial pleasantries, he addressed the situation directly. "I've been reviewing family photographs," he began, stirring his coffee with characteristic precision. "There are distinctive features, the shape of your eyes, certain expressions, that I now recognize as Robert's, rather than coincidental genetic expression." The observation was offered without bitterness, a historian noting previously misinterpreted evidence rather than a betrayed husband cataloging deceptions. This analytical approach seemed to provide emotional distance that helped him navigate the painful personal dimensions of these revelations. "I spoke with your mother at length yesterday," he continued. "She provided additional context about that period that helps explain, if not excuse, what happened. The fertility treatments had been particularly difficult, hormonal medications, affecting her emotional stability, repeated disappointments undermining our relationship, my own withdrawal into academic work as coping mechanism." His willingness to acknowledge his own role in the complicated circumstances demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity, refusing simplistic victim narratives in favor of nuanced understanding of human vulnerability and error. "What happens between your mother and me remains uncertain," he acknowledged. 28 years of marriage can't be easily discarded, but neither can it continue without fundamental reassessment. We've agreed to a period of separation while maintaining open communication." I nodded, respecting his measured approach to these deeply personal decisions. "And regarding the verification process?" I asked, shifting toward the more immediate practical concerns. "I'll participate fully," he confirmed. "Whatever discomfort it causes me personally is secondary to ensuring Theodore's wishes are properly executed. Richard cannot be allowed to manipulate family pain for financial advantage." His principled commitment despite personal cost reinforced my appreciation for the man who had raised me. Whatever biology might dictate, William Mitchell had demonstrated paternal loyalty and ethical backbone throughout my life and continued to do so in crisis. "There's something else you should know," he added, his expression becoming more focused. "I've been receiving calls from Harrison Mills expressing concerns about Richard's approach to the verification process. Apparently, Richard has been attempting to expedite procedures in ways that might compromise thoroughness or attempting to substitute alternative testing facilities with connections to Mitchell business interests." This information aligned with our anticipated concerns about Richard's potential interference. "Harrison is resisting these pressures?" "So far," William confirmed. "But he's clearly uncomfortable with the conflict between his long-standing relationship with Richard and his legal obligations as executor. I suggested he consult directly with the verification committee at Boston University to establish independent protocols beyond either Richard's or my influence." The insight demonstrated William's strategic thinking beyond emotional reaction, recognizing the importance of process integrity regardless of personal impact. His intervention with Harrison represented valuable support for proper execution of Theodore's carefully designed verification system. "Thank you for that," I said sincerely. Maintaining independent verification is essential to the process Theodore established. William nodded acknowledgement before shifting to more personal terrain. "I've also been thinking about Robert, not just as biological contributor to your existence, but as my brother. Our relationship was complicated, certainly, but in reviewing older family materials, I'm recognizing dimensions of him I never fully appreciated during his lifetime." This willingness to reconsider fixed narratives, to examine complex relationships with fresh perspective despite personal pain, exemplified William's scholarly integrity applied to personal matters. Rather than allowing hurt to calcify into simplified vilification, he was engaging with the full complexity of human relationships and motivations. "I found some of his journals and environmental activism materials in the archives," I shared. "They show a depth of principle and purpose I never understood from family discussions." The official family narrative about Robert was always incomplete, William acknowledged. Richard particularly preferred characterizing him as merely irresponsible, rather than principled in his differences with family expectations. Theodore understood him better than any of us, I think. This more nuanced understanding of Robert, shared now between William and me despite the complicated circumstances, created unexpected connection transcending biological relationships. Whatever paternity tests might eventually confirm, William and I were building a new relationship founded on shared values and mutual respect, rather than merely assumed genetic connection. As our breakfast concluded, William addressed the emotional terrain directly. Whatever the verification process determines, Livy, you remain my daughter in all meaningful senses. Biology establishes certain facts, but doesn't define relationships, formed through decades of shared experience and genuine care. His unequivocal affirmation, offered without qualification despite the profound disruption of his understanding, demonstrated emotional generosity that transcended legal or biological technicalities. This capacity to maintain authentic connection, despite painful truth, represented a form of strength more significant than Richard's calculated maneuvering or financial acumen. The remainder of Sunday was devoted to practical preparation for Monday's initial verification procedures. Elaine had confirmed I was scheduled for sample collection at 10 a.m. at Boston University Medical Center, with Richard and his sons assigned afternoon appointments. William would provide his sample Tuesday morning, ensuring separation that minimized potential discomfort. The evening brought another unexpected development: a text message from Charles Mitchell, Richard's elder son and presumed heir to leadership of Mitchell family businesses. Need to speak with you privately before tomorrow's verification procedures. No hostility intended. Matter of mutual interest. Coffee at Thinking Cup on Tremont at 8 a.m.? The outreach was surprising, given our historically distant relationship. Though technically first cousins, Charles and I had little meaningful connection, beyond obligatory interaction at family events. He had followed Richard into business leadership directly after completing his MBA, adopting similar perspectives and approaches regarding family legacy management. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.